Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, finally I'm ready. Sorry it took a bit. Had a little plumbing problem to take care of before I got started, so that's sort of fixed. So we can go ahead and get started tonight. This will be a fairly short, I think fairly short lesson tonight. You know me. After the arduous lessons we went through with Revelation, this should be kind of more of a relaxing and fun trip through the book of Esther. But let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, as we come again into your presence and we open your precious book, Lord, I pray tonight that you will anoint your word as it goes forth. And Lord, anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have said, and just be in our presence tonight. And we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. I want to give you some information about the book of Esther, because Esther is one of those books, it's a story, and we all kind of know the story, and we kind of read it, and it's not, Esther isn't a book that we look at if we want to find some real theology, or we want to really find something out about the Lord. We go to the book of Esther. It's just not one of those books. In fact, it is one of the strangest and odd books in the Old Testament. After the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, this is the only book that deals with the dispersed Jews. Now, the Jews of the dispersion, for those who aren't familiar with that, you'll remember that the Assyrians came into Israel, and they took captive the nation of Israel. That was the 10 northern tribes. And what they did is they brought them back to us, scattered them everywhere. It's called the dispersion, and they just put them everywhere, so they could never again get together and be a nation. Well, that was the 10 tribes. We still had the 2 tribes down in Judah. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar came along, he brought the 2 tribes to Babylon, and he was just an absolutely, I think you would say, from a secular standpoint, one of the more perfect rulers or kings that you would run across from a secular point of view. Because he took all of the best. That's where Daniel comes in the 3 Hebrew children. He brought the best, and he brought them to Babylon. He incorporated them into his system, and it didn't matter if you were a Jew or who you were. If you were able to do the job, you got the job. And that's why Daniel was elevated to the position that he had. And so he not only conquered countries, but he brought their smartest people back with him, and then he incorporated their culture into his culture. So it was, in a way, kind of like the United States. We have people come from all over the world, and that's how we formed our nation. We brought cultures in, we brought, and the smartest people, roles in the governments and things, and that's kind of the same idea that Nebuchadnezzar had, only he was a very cruel king. I'm not saying he was a perfect person, but his way of handling those that he conquered was excellent. Well, part of that was he also dispersed the Jews from Judah, the nation of Judah. However, instead of just shoving them out there with the idea that we're going to so you never come together again, his idea was, I will take the best and put them in Babylon. Then I'll take the next tier and I'll put them in my cities, in my areas that I am over, in the different nations that he conquered. I'll put them over there because they will bring their culture and their wisdom to those areas. So his thought was, by dispersing, he would take the best by level and disperse them out. I mean, perfect plan, right? Really, from a secular idea, this was a great plan. Well, the book of Esther is the only book that talks about or even addresses the people of the dispersion. So these were the dispersed Jews that we're going to be reading about, not the Palestinian Jews. Palestinian Jews, of course, were those in either Israel or in Judah or in their immediate, right there by the Jordan River, between there and the Mediterranean. That's kind of what the whole book is about, except for this book right here. After the first 5 chapters, understand, because there was no Jews in Garden of Eden. Yeah. Anyway, so we're looking at a very, very different book. And when we read this book, we have to look at it through very different eyes. When we see that something was done, we can't look at it and say, well, David would have never done that, or this would never have happened under King Solomon or something. That doesn't, they don't play together. They're two different things. So we have to understand these are not the Jews that we're used to reading about. Okay, so it's different. Not only is this book different in the fact that it talks about dispersed Jews, but it also has no reference, no mention to God or the names of God.
Wow.
Every book in the Bible refers to God, either Jehovah, Elohim, Adonai, Jesus in the New Testament. There is no mention of God in the book of Esther. There is only 1 or 2 scriptures that kind of give the impression that there's a God. Otherwise, it doesn't. Now, this book was written, honestly, nobody knows, okay? It's one of those situations. They do have figured that it was probably Mordecai, that we're going to read about, Esther's uncle, who actually wrote the book, or at least provided all the information for the book. Whether he scribed it or not, we don't know. And there are several reasons for that, not the least of which is the extreme detail that's given in this book. When you look at we're going to be looking at the feast or banquet that Ahasuerus put on. When we look at the detail that's in that would have only come from somebody who was actually at the feast. How would you know who he talked to for counsel? How would you know about the goblets that everybody was drinking out of, and those little minute details? So it was somebody that was there. And it was also somebody who was familiar with the conversations between Mordecai and Esther. So, that kind of narrows it down to either a servant that was there or Mordecai himself. Some ascribe this to the high priest Joachim, who was the high priest in Jerusalem at that time. Of course, there are some problems there. Number one, how did he know about all those details unless he went and talked to Mordecai? And, would the high priest do that? Would he have the time to go and do that? Probably not. And also the writing, the type of writing, the way it's written, is very much in the idea of someone who lives in Persia, not somebody who would have lived in Palestine. The wording would have been much different. As you know, if somebody is from the South here in the United States and they write something, they write it in a different tone. And they use words that aren't used up north, or up east. So that's a couple of things there. So it probably was Mordecai. Now, it was written sometime after 465 BC. Based on the verbiage and again the language, what it covers. It was probably written sometime after the death of Ahasuerus, and Ahasuerus died in 465 BC. He was executed, assassinated, if you will, by his age. So it was probably around 485 BC that this book was written. That's a long time ago. A long time ago. The subject of the book, as of course, as I said, is centered around the Jews of the dispersion. The reason this is important is because we get the mistaken idea from this book. As you know, the general idea was that Haman was going to have all of the Jews killed. And so he wanted that decree, you know, to go out from I'm going to keep saying his name wrong till I fall on the grave. Ahasuerus. To put out that decree that all the Jews eventually should be killed. That would not have wiped out the Jews. We're only talking about the Jews of the dispersion who were in the Persian Empire. Those in Palestine would not have been included in that because they were not under the rule of Ahasuerus. He could only rule, he could only put edicts for his empire that did not at that time include the Jews in Palestine. So you have a much different view of what this book is about. Get out of there. Okay, so let's look. Who was King Ahasuerus? Now, this is a big controversy, and you can read all the commentaries, and they'll give you all kinds of crazy information. Some are based on the wording or the name. Some are based on the historical significance of the time. But I think the majority all agree that this has to do with a king by the name of Xerxes. So we can bring it down to that level. Now, which Xerxes was this? There was Xerxes the Great, there was Xerxes the First, Xerxes the Second, Xerxes the Third. Who was this guy? And it becomes really problematic at times, because if we take one of the Xerxes that would tend to be everybody, this is the one that would probably be there. Mordecai would have had to have been about 150 or 160 years old, and they didn't live that long in that they'd already aging had already taking them down. So that would have been a rather difficult situation. So anyway, I don't want to go into all of that, but I think most of the thought that seems to be the best is that it was Xerxes the First. And I want to read this. Xerxes the First, Old Persian Kasha, which merely means the king. All right. By name, Xerxes the Great. He was born in 519 BC, and he died in 465. Persepolis, Iran. That's where he was killed at, Persepolis, Iran. Persian king from 486 to 465. The son and successor of Darius the First. He's best known for the massive invasion of Greece from across the Hellespont in 480 BC, a campaign marked by the battle of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. His ultimate defeat spelled the beginning of the decline of the Achaemenid Empire. Okay, great. So that's probably who this Ahasuerus is. I wanted to mention a little bit about this battle with the Greeks because it plays its part in the book. Even though the book doesn't cover it, it was probably the main reason for having this massive feast that we're going to look at tonight. And I'll talk a little bit about it when we get there. But the issue here was that Darius the First, Xerxes the first father, had tried to capture Greece and add it to the empire. And he was utterly defeated in his effort. And it left a mark on the Persian Empire. What we're looking at here, by the way, is the Persian Mede Empire. Persian and Mede Empire. These were the ones who defeated Nebuchadnezzar, okay, and the Babylonian Empire. So if you remember our Revelation, the head of gold, and then we had the silver, the shoulders and chest. That was the Medes and the Persians. That is the empire that we're talking about here. Now this empire went all the way from India down to Ethiopia. So this was not a small, over in the east somewhere. Almost all the way through what was later to become Macedonia. It was massive. And so he decided he wanted to defeat the Greeks, to gain back the prestige that his father had lost in the battle with Greece. The problem with Xerxes was that he had an ego that was far bigger than his brain. He decided he just decided he wanted to do this. Now he planned it out, and he planned it for several years. The unfortunate thing was that he put a massive army together, a massive army, hundreds of thousands of troops, and took off to go do the battle. Well, in order to get to Greece, there is a channel that you have to cross. It's about 160 feet wide, and this is at a place that here is called Hell's Point. And it is, I forget the name of it today, but it's just this channel that runs up at the top of Turkey, goes through. And so he sent a crew ahead of him to build the bridges for his army. Now that's good thinking, build the bridges for your army. The only problem was he didn't take into account how stormy it was in the season that he sent him up there to build the bridges. So by the time his army of hundreds of thousands of troops reached the point to cross the bridges, they weren't there. The storms had destroyed them. It was mostly for looks. It was not well trained. It was not of the caliber of the Spartan army or the Grecian army. And so on hand-to-hand, man-to-man, they were going to lose. I mean, they just did not have the skill sets in their army to actually defeat Greece. He felt by coming in with a mass amount, he could just overrun them, and they just give up at the sight of his army. Also on his way, he held parades all the way along the way, military parades, paraded his army, and he was out in front, hey, look at me. That's this guy. He also had a very hot temper and often acted very irrational. Well, the way they finally got across the canal is considered one of the greatest military, what do you want to say, not ad lib, but just at the spur of the moment. He took ships and he tied the ships together, and he made two bridges, and he covered these with cables that he fastened in and actually winched cables tight, using the ships in the middle, put planks across it, and then covered it with dirt and sand so the horses wouldn't spook. And actually took his army. He took his army on one bridge, and all of the servants and all of the logistics that go with moving an army went on the other bridge. And he actually moved them all across in less than a week. And in those days, that was quite a feat. But that's what he's really known for. is that particular crossing of this canal. About 160 yards long. He had to build the bridge, which today is, not that much, but in those days, that was quite a feat. Well, he got over on the other side and, of course, started battling. He had some very good military victories until Sparta. He came up against Sparta. And Sparta actually led to his defeat. And that defeat actually led to the eventual crumbling of the Persian Mede Empire. So that's just a little quick history of this king and who he was. All right. Now there's also a question about the authenticity of the book, and many feel that this was not actually an event that happened. We're talking now about Queen Esther and this particular thing. Many feel that it was a novelette. In other words, it was just like a romantic mystery. It was set in those times, but it didn't really happen. Others feel that it was, something else. Somebody was pinning this at a much later date in order to have a basis for the Purim. I don't know if you know what that is, the Purim, but it's a festival the Jews have every year that celebrates Esther. And this is another interesting thing, because all of the feasts that the Jews keep have to do with something in Jerusalem or the law that was given to Moses. All right? This is the only one that celebrates something that did not affect Palestinian Jews. It was the Purim. And they celebrate this as a big festival. I mean, big, they dress, it's kind of like Rio, only not that crazy, lewdness and stuff. But I mean, they dress in costumes and they do, it's just a fun festival kind of thing. And many feel that this was written to substantiate that. I don't know. But if it's in this book, it happened. Or it's going to tell me it's a parable. Or it's going to tell me that this is just, an example. Okay. Any questions on that? All right, let's get into the book. Starting with chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Azarias, this was the Azarias who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Azarias sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants. The powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed them the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. All right, that's a few days. All right, so the empire of, as I said, of Persia at this time extended from India to Ethiopia. It included 127 provinces. Now, we think about a province as being just a small piece. These were actually countries for the most part. For instance, you would have the province of Ethiopia or the province of Syria. Well, he had 127 of them. So obviously some of them were smaller, some were larger. And by the way, the only Persian king whose empire extended into India was Azarias the First. So that's one of the reasons why they feel that that's what it is. Now they had satraps, and these satraps were, that's a word, Persian word, that means same as governor. So they had satraps. And these satraps, or governors, ruled over each of these provinces. Now they ruled in the name of the king. So it wasn't like, we have a country that we defeat, let's take Japan for example. In World War II, we defeated Japan. Well, we allowed Japan to still be Japan. They had their own rulers. The only thing was, we made agreements with them that said, hey, you know, you're not going to go to war anymore. You're not going to have a military that's capable of launching crusades anymore. But we didn't go in there and say, okay, you're now part of the United States, and by the way, we're putting a governor over you. Now, we do that. For instance, Puerto Rico is a territory of ours. And the governor of Puerto Rico would be the same as the president of Puerto Rico. So that's more like what was set up here. Now, we didn't do that just because we conquered them. It was a request on their part, and they have elections regularly and so forth. So it's, you know, it's a little bit different, but the structure is basically the same. So when you think about 127 countries that was under Persian rule, you've got 127 governors that were under rule. Now, under those governors, of course, you had mayors, you've got, we have counties, so we have county executives. They had a very similar structure, so you had regions, within the regions you had cities. So there was a lot of, a very great political structure within the Persian Empire. So, for some reason, Ahasuerus decided that he wanted to have a feast. And he wanted to have everybody there. So in the 3rd year of his reign, he invited all of his officials to come to Shushan, which was where he was in residence at that time, and come to this banquet or this feast that lasted 180 days. Now, during the time that Ahasuerus ruled over Persia, Shushan was the name of the citadel or palace that was the winter residence of the Persian rulers and considered the ordinary seat of government. So when we say Shushan in this context, it was a palace. And this palace was very unique. It was built on land that was artificial. They actually built a hill, constructed a hill to put the citadel on, or the palace on. It had 7 walls that were circular, and each wall was a little bit higher than the outside wall. So if you looked at it, you saw these 7 rows of wall going up. Each wall was painted a different color. So when you looked at it, you know, you'd see red, blue, green, and these strips up the wall. Wow. So it was quite a structure. Very, very difficult to impregnate those walls. You would have to go through 7 large walls in order to get into the middle, which is where the palace was, and you know, the king's quarters and those kinds of things. Now, this was not a little structure. They could put thousands of people in the courtyard in the palace. Now, they know that because they've excavated it. Wow. So they know how big this thing is. Absolutely amazing, you know, construction. And that was what was considered Shushan. Now, the town, or the citadel, was later associated with the town that was next to it. It was built on the outskirts of Susha, later becomes Shushan. So today, if you go over there, you know, you'll find this. Of course, today it's a nice modern town. But there was a town that stretched out away from this hill, and on the hill was the citadel or the palace. So that's the way it was situated. It was located 434 miles west-southwest of what is today Tehran. So if you wanted to get there, it was, in those days, it was quite a journey to get there. It takes 7 hours now to get there by car. Wow. From Tehran to Shushan. And it's quite a tourist attraction now. People come from all over the world to see this Shushan where the Persian and Mede rulers lived. Now, the tomb of Daniel, the prophet, is located in the town of Shushan. which makes it, of course, again, a lot of Jews come, and Christians alike, just to see the tomb of Daniel. Now, during the summer months, the royal residence was at Ecbatana, which is about 160 miles west-southwest of what is today Tehran. Now, the difference was it was very, very hot in Sushan in the summer. So in the summer, when it was so hot, they moved to these names. I wish they'd speak English. Ecbatana, which was elevated, and it was but well above sea level, and it caught the breezes that were much cooler, and so it was much more comfortable. So in the summer months, when it was so hot, they would move there, and they would take the royal residence, and that became the center of the Persian Empire during summer. The rest of the time, they would move back to Sushan, and that's where they carried it. And this is not uncommon. When I was in Lithuania, we saw the palace of Queen Anne, which was the winter residence of the Queen of Russia. So the czars and the queens, they all did the same thing. They would move, when it was so cold in Russia, they would move down to Lithuania, and they would be in a warmer area. So that was pretty common in those days. We're much stronger, I think. We just stay in one spot and let it happen. I mean, don't seem to worry about that. Okay, so during the third year of his reign, Ahasuerus hosted a feast for all his officials and servants. Now the servants mentioned here, they're not talking about servants, that serve things or were in the palace. The servants he's talking about here would be those of a less rank than a ruler. So in other words, the mayor comes and he brings an entourage with him of people. That's who he's talking about, the ones that came with the officials. And these were all men, by the way. There were no women allowed at these feasts. These were all men. And we'll see about that in a minute. Very chauvinistic, very chauvinistic. All right. So this group represented all the rulers of the province of the Persian Empire. And there's a lot of questions about why he put the feast, but I think most assumptions are that he gave this feast for the express purpose of having all of his officials there so he could ask counsel, which really probably amounted to, I'm going to do this, you all understand, about his coming invasion of Greece. Because we know he had been preparing for it for a good number of years. Probably his father started the actual rebuilding of the military and getting ready for another attempt to take Greece. You know, in those days, those people were focused on who they could conquer. It was a matter, not a matter of how great my kingdom is, it's how can I conquer somebody else? I mean, that seemed to be the mindset in those days. And, you know, the Grecian conqueror, when he got through conquering everybody, it's terrible when you get old. I can see him, I just can't speak his name. When he got all through, he sat down and cried because there was nothing else to conquer.
Oh, jeez.
Well, power.
Yeah, just give me more power. I gotta. And we see that occasionally, even in today. We saw it, of course, with Hitler. We saw it with the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, and we see that occasionally that crops up. That feeling that I have to conquer more. And we certainly see it in the business world, in the financial world.
Yeah.
The richest guys, of course, that's kind of turning, but for many years, the richest guys were the ones who always wanted to have more.
Yeah.
We see it in the ball players, in pro athletes. Nothing makes me any madder than to have some pro athlete say, I'm not showing up because you're not extending my contract. I'm only making $8 million a year. I need to make 10. You know, me? Fine. Go get a job. Find out what it's like to work. And I'm a sports fan, don't get me wrong. But that just really irritates me, because half of those guys, and you see it later when they retire, doesn't take them long to blow through all their money, and then they're standing around saying, I can't, I'm poor, I gotta go to, because they don't know how to do anything. Anyway, we gotta move on. All right. Now, this feast lasted for 180 days or 6 months. About 6 months. How would you like to put on a feast for literally thousands of guests and have it run for 6 months?
It's a lot of food.
Yeah. Now,
Oh, yeah.
it probably, and of course it doesn't say, but more than likely this doesn't mean that these guys came and stayed there for 6 months. But the feast lasted 6 months, and they probably came and went. Just from common sense, if I'm a governor, I'm not going to turn my area over to somebody else for 6 months, especially in those times. Because in those times, you know, your reign was very tenuous. You might come back and walk through the gates and get, you know, boom, 3 arrows hit you. You know, so more than likely the feast lasted that long, but the guys didn't stay there that long. They came, and I would kind of picture this to be that the king probably had numerous business sessions that covered the same material when they came through. See, I look at it very much like an organization, excuse me, business organization, or today a government entity, where you have this many people involved. You're going to go over that material several times, and you're going to get ideas, and you're going to, and I think Ahasuerus probably was doing that with all of these people as they came through. All right. Notice this, that King Ahasuerus showed those in attendance all the riches and splendor of the kingdom. Now this, of course, going along with his enormous ego, you know, he had to show everybody what we have. Now, it's kind of interesting here, and I'm going to make note of it here, that we don't hear, or we're not told a lot about what the palace looked like for this banquet, or for this feast. We're told a few things that kind of give us a feel for it, but we're not really showing a whole lot. In this next feast that we're going to look at, his second feast, we're given quite a bit of detail, which I find to be quite interesting. And when we cover the second feast, I think you'll see, you know, why that is. Now, this showing of the riches, of course, it was his ego, but this also may have been a ploy to convince everybody that the invasion of Greece would be a success based on the riches and power that he had. And this would fit with his whole strategy for going to war with Greece. Make a huge army. Make it look like I've got 600,000, or I don't know the exact number, but of trained soldiers. We're going to parade them in every town we come to, and when we come to Greece, we're going to scare them to death. We're just going to show them how great we are. And in order to get that backing, because remember, the army had to come from these 127 provinces. I mean, you know, it's all right to say, I want you to send me all your guys, and then the governor say, yeah, we'll send them 10. You know, we're going to hide the rest of them. You can legislate things, but it doesn't mean it ever gets done, okay, especially in this large of a situation. So this was probably a ploy to get them to get on board, get enthusiastic about sending this army to Greece. Now, part of the entertainment, and some of this comes from history, and later the request that he made to his queen. Part of the entertainment was dancing girls, either partially or completely unclothed. So it was a big strip deal. You know, we see the belly dancers today, you know, you've seen the, you know, that's from that time. You can kind of see it was very seductive type dancing, and they seemed that it was either partially or completely unclothed with these dancers. So that's what was going on at this feast. Now it's also interesting, there's nothing mentioned about food. So this kind of indicates it was more like a banquet than a feast. The banquet was, there was food there, but it was second fiddle to the drinking. We learn all about the drinking. Yeah. And that was the big thing. Come and get drunk. I mean, this was, you know, this was kind of the, it's kind of like you go on business trips today. I used to have to go on business trips, you know, for Boeing, and we'd go into a town, and you know, you'd no sooner get settled in your hotel, and they knock, come on, we're going to dinner. We'd go to dinner, and it would be, there was, especially in LA, there was one bar there in LA. It was, well, it was a lounge, but it was where all of the business people met. I mean, it wasn't some dive out there. I don't mean to leave that impression. But they had free food, so we'd go eat our dinner there and save the meal money, you know, put it in our pocket. But they had, I mean, they would have fried chicken. I mean, it was a big spread of free food. But all of the buyers, sellers, they all met there, and this is where business was conducted. And then it was get drunk time, and you know, usually that's when I decided I'll go back on the shuttle back to the hotel. I don't want to do it. But that was the big thing on the trip. You know, oh, we're going to go and get drunk. And that's the way it was in those days. Men never change. I mean, this is just part of business, unfortunately. All right, so that was the feast, at least this first part of it. Let's read on now. Verse 5. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days. So the first feast lasted 180. And that was for all of his officials. We have no information about it other than he had a feast and who was there. Now, at the end of that one, okay, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the were of gold and silver on the mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Now, this is strange. I can understand the Bible talking about this huge feast where he brought all of his officials in. But why this feast? This was not a feast for the officials. And by the way, you've probably heard how many times that Vashti was asked to dance before all the rulers and officials of the kingdom. That's not true. This was for all the people who lived in the citadel. Now, who lived in the citadel? In the palace. Now, if you go to France and Paris and to the Versailles Palace, and it was under King Louis XIV and XV, just to run the palace took 5,000 servants.
Oh, wow.
Now, compare that to Azariah's. How many servants did it take to run Shushan? Think about it. There were thousands. And notice what it says. This was for everybody. both large or important and not important. The janitor just swept the streets. He got invited to this banquet.
Oh, nice.
Can you imagine? You're a guy, you know, you've been cleaning up in Shushan for years, and all of a sudden you get this invitation that says, we're having a banquet. We want you in the king's palace, in the court of the king. We're going to have a 7-day banquet. Whoa! Hey! Can you imagine how they felt? Whoa! And then to walk into the court and see these tapestries. Now, you know, it just we see this and we picture tapestries on the wall. The courtyard that they have excavated, they figure they could put several thousand people in that courtyard at one time. And what it's talking about are awnings that were stretched over the top to keep the sun off during the feast. Just like we go out and put pop-ups up, right? Up. They had these awnings. Now these just weren't any old awnings. These were awnings of fine white linen. And what's actually meant here was that it had the purple or lavender trim on it, which were the colors of the Persian Empire. And it had silver rods that went the length that these things were fastened to, and at either end they were fastened to the pillars. Now these weren't marble pillars, the English says marble, but actually the word means that they were a granite, or a quarried granite, which is far more difficult to work with actually than marble. And so they were actually on hooks that were set into these marble pillars, just to keep the sun off. And the cups, the goblets that they drank the wine out of were gold. No two were alike. Wow. Why in the world would anybody want to throw a banquet like that for his servants?
To show off.
Well, when we look at it through the eyes of Ahasuerus, you can kind of see. If I treat my servants this way, if I go to all this expense for my servants, how great am I? How wealthy am I? You see, it was all self-gratification. Look how good I am. Look how great I am. Look at how I treat my servants.
Right.
Wow. Of course, this included the military personnel that were there. And I'm sure this banquet was given under the guise, or possibly too, I shouldn't say that, as a reward for the hard work that went into 6 months of merrymaking. The officials. Think about how hard these people had to work, not the citadel, the palace up, but now they've got all of these guys coming and going. They're spending there, so you know you've got porters that have to, you know, get the rooms, and people that have to clean the rooms, and you know, not like we do today, but I'm sure that they had the service that had to be there, all the food that had to be prepared, all the other stuff, and of course they didn't have in-room facilities, so that all had to be taken care of, and the sanitary part of that. I mean, when you look at it, you can start to see how immense the effort was to put on that first banquet. This may have been a way of rewarding his servants, which is really smart when you think about it, because you may get mad at him, but man, I remember that banquet, and look what he did for us. You know. So that was probably what was going on. These awnings, by the way, were 60 feet long. 60 feet long. The floor, it says, you know, it looks like it's talking about colors, but it's actually talking about 4 different stones. In the original Persian, it's actually 4 types of stone. one of the alabaster, which would be a white stone. The rest of them nobody knows for sure. Probably the black comes out as some kind of a black, maybe an onyx or something. But it was the idea the floor had 4 colors in this mosaic floor that was on the thing. All right, this thing lasted for 7 days. Now there was an abundance of wine that came actually from the king's wine cellar. And of course the king would have in his wine cellar only the finest of wines. So they were served not just wine they were used to drinking. This was the exquisite stuff, you know. This is the stuff that you have to go to the wine merchant to get just the right year. You know, this was bottled in a great year, 1986. Okay, if you say so. Shows you how much I know about wine. It's red or white or pink or something, I think. Anyway, so they were given all this royal or good wine. Now it could be noted also, the historians tell us that King Ahasuerus did not drink that royal wine that he had in his wine cellar. He had a special wine that he drank. And it was called the wine Hilbon. It was grown in a special region, and it was just, you know, the perfect wine. It'd be one of those things where you'd pay, you know, a couple $1,000s a bottle for today. Very, very, very rare, very special wine. And that's what he drank. Okay. Now, it's also interesting to note that he made an edict, especially for this occasion, that the attendees at the feast could not be forced to drink. If he had to make that edict, then the assumption has to be all other times they were forced to drink. And this was part of Persian culture, by the way. The Persians and the Medes were very heavy drinkers. So if you were brought to a banquet or a feast, you were expected to get plastered. You were expected to get drunk. It's like some cultures when you have dinner, you're expected to leave some on your plate. Some places you're expected to take your napkin and fold it up and put it on the table. Other places you're expected to wad it up and put it in your plate. You know, there are all kinds of customs that people have to show that you were enjoying the feast or the dinner. And in this one, you were supposed to get drunk. Okay. But he made a special edict. Now, we're not told why. But when we consider who was at the banquet, would you want all the servants in your castle all drunk? All the men? Including all the soldiers that are there to protect you. Now, I didn't say they couldn't, but they didn't have to. And I think this shows again, some of the ability of the king to make some interesting decisions and that were made sense. So many of them didn't make sense. But this one kind of does. So anyway, they did not have, this was a break with tradition. So, and again, these were all the men. These were all men. All right, verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bitzah, Harbona, Bagtha, Abagtha, Zithar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the queen's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Now when Azarias entertained all the men in the palace, Vashti hosted a similar feast for the women. Now it wasn't in this probably as quite as elaborate, but it was in the women's quarters. This would be the harem rooms. And you know, we think about a small area. Some of these kings had hundreds of wives. So they all had to be housed. You know, they had community centers, they had a, you know, huge, and I don't mean community basketball, I'm just talking about communal centers, you know, large areas. They had eating facilities, probably where they all ate together. So it was in these rooms, in the harem rooms, which were off limits to men. Men could not go there. The only ones allowed to enter the harem were the eunuchs. And of course, these were men who had no desire for women, I'll put it that way. Either they were born that way or made that way. And so they could be trusted. And so these were the men that took care of the harems, were the eunuchs. So she put on this vast feast. And women were not also allowed to eat with the men in public occasions. They could eat at home, you know, with their men, obviously, in a family. But they could not go to a feast. You never saw women there. Even in the days of Jesus, this was true. The women served, the men ate. Like in the days of, or in the Palestinians, they had the couches, and they would sit on these couches, you know, lay down and eat. They would eat with one hand, and they'd hold their head up with the other, or they would put pillows under it. They didn't serve steaks and things, you know, everything was eaten with your fingers and hands. A lot of it was grapes and cheese and figs and, you know, the things that we think about. They would cook chickens or beef, and it was in pieces. So it kind of like, you know, you go to one of these Japanese steak places where they throw the knives in the air, you know, and all of that. And you order a steak, and by the time they get done, you get little pieces. These little pieces of steak. It was kind of that way. That's the way they served it. And it would be the same with the women. And I assume, I don't know, but I would assume they probably, like women today, you know, would rather have cheeses and grapes and crackers and, you know, fancy things rather than a leg off a chicken and a, you know, something else. So I'm sure it was much fancier, much daintier than what the men were eating. But these were in the women's quarters. Also, it says that that it belonged to in the palace of the king, and the location, according to what they've unearthed, was probably at the south end of the palace. That seemed to be where these harem rooms were located, from what they've excavated. Now, after drinking for 7 days, and he's drinking this very good wine, king was drunk, and history says he could hold his wine pretty good. By the way, he was a heavy drinker, so he probably put down a lot of wine. He wanted to show his immense vanity by ordering his wife Vashti to appear before the feast wearing only her crown. The original Hebrew on this indicates when it says wearing her royal crown, it means wearing only her royal crown. That's where this comes from. So the idea was, we've had all these dancing girls, we've had all of this opulence, and even for the servants, by the way, evidently they were having the same dancing and all of that, entertainment, basically the same. He couldn't think of anything else now that he could show how really great he was. What else could he show? And you say, well, he didn't show his servants all his wealth. He didn't need to. They saw it all the time. So it was things they did not see. The queens and wives also were kept out of the public eye. If you were married, you didn't go out in public, and we see that today in Islam, by the way, with they cover themselves completely. That was prevalent in Persia, and so what the women just did. Now, once they were married, they were out of the social view of men, and the queen especially was not shown to men. So here he was, and he says, I only have one thing left I can show that nobody's seen. The queen. And she was evidently very, very beautiful. Her name, Vashti, and it has different meanings, different dialects, but one of them that I caught was the best of the best. Vashti, best of the best. So she was probably the most beautiful creature Ahasuerus had ever looked at, and so he wanted her to come out and show her beauty to all of these men.
Nice.
However, she refused, and this was in direct defiance to the king. You know, there's been a lot of comments made about Vashti. A lot of them saying, you know, she was such a terrible person. And in history, they've tied her to different women in history that may have been, you know, they had different names in the Persian courts. And different ones, and they found some that might have been Vashti, and they talk about one in particular, how nasty she was. You know, she wanted to control, and she was terrible, she was mean to everybody, she was this, she was that. But when I see Vashti, I don't see those particular things. Just in the giving of the banquet, why did she take the time to give a feast to the women? Just to show her husband she could do it? You know. I'm sure that would not have even held a candle to what he was putting on. So I think it was a matter that she felt the women needed to be recognized a little bit also, since they probably did the lion's share of the work. The cooking and cleaning and stuff, that would all have been women. So she had the banquet in the first place. Also, I think there is a certain aspect of her that we have to look at, and that is her morality. If she was an immoral person, sure, I'll come out. Yeah, man, you know, I'll show them how great and beautiful I am. You know, but she had that certain moral value. She also understood laws and customs. Laws and customs. And she acted according to those laws and customs. I think she was much smarter than her husband, to be frankly honest with you. Now, because the king had made a public command, her refusal was a rebuke to Ahasuerus. If he had have asked that in private and she said no, he probably would have, okay, yeah, you're probably right. But doing it in public, oh, now it's a problem. Because all of these people sitting out there witnessed this. That's why it's always unwise when you have something pop into your head to do it before you step back, think about it, and take counsel. Because what you're doing probably is going to create some issues, as it did here. Now the act completely defeated the king's attempt to display his omnipotence and became an immense embarrassment to him. He's showing off, and all of a sudden his wife doesn't even, don't even go along with him. Yeah. So it backfired on him. And of course he became furious. However, one thing we have to give him credit for is he kept his anger inside. He could have immediately called for, bring her out here, whether she likes it or not. Stick her head over there, and I want to see that head rolling down the aisle. He could have done that. But he didn't. At least he kept his temper and took counsel in this case. All right. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsina, and Mumakan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. All right. So we have these 7 guys. These were considered the wisest men in the kingdom. They were the one who had unlimited access to the king. These were the 7 guys who could walk into the king's chamber at any time and talk with him. Everybody else, you know, you had to walk in and hope he accepted you. These guys never had to worry about being accepted before the king. And Ahasuerus was one of those kings, and we'll find that out later in the story. But they could just walk in. Say, hey, King Ahaz, I got something here. You know. So they were the closest. These were the 7 wisest men in government. They were his closest advisors. Today that would be in the presidency, for instance. You have the chief of staff. He can go in and see the president. He doesn't have to, you know, he just walks in. Whatever the president's doing, he knows about it anyway. You know, he's that close. So he just walks in. Vice president, he just walk in. Well, that's kind of what these guys were at that level. They just walk in. And so they, he consulted them. And notice what he asks here. He said, what should we do with her? And according to the law. So it wasn't just a matter of what should I do. It's what does the law say I should do? Or can do, or can't do. And this is kind of interesting because it said this was the manner of Ahasuerus. So anytime he came into anything that had to do with the law, he was careful to always, or assuming this means this was his manner, to always ask about the law. Nice of people to do that today before they go off and make laws. They find out if it's legal or not. But he always wanted to find out what the law had to say. And I think that's to his credit. But it also tells us that they had a very robust system of law under the Persian rule. And history backs this up. They had laws that were very detailed, and unlike the laws of Israel, which were based on the 10 Commandments, based on ritual, based on religion, their laws were based strictly secular. And they had a very, very robust law. And these 7 guys were considered to be the best lawyers or smartest guys in the law. And so he's asking them, what can I do because she disobeyed the king? All right. Now these 7 princes that were mentioned here, there were from the 7 families of the first rank in Persia, from which alone the king could take his wives. This is interesting. Please note this. Their chiefs were entitled to have free access to the monarch's person. So there were 7 major families in Persian court. These men were the heads of those 7 families, and that's what made them so smart. So I'm saying that kind of facetiously. But it's also interesting, a small statement here, that the king had to take his wives from the families, one of the families of these 7. File that for a few minutes. All right. So what were they to do with Vashti? Now this question did not include or consider the outrageousness of the king's request or the fact that Vashti was hosting her own feast. What's interesting here is that the law specifically forbid women to appear, wives, to appear unclothed in front of other men. That was one of the laws. So the king asking for that was in fact a violation